if you were able to sit down with Luther and maybe give him a lesson on understanding the inner logic of a position he doesn't hold, what is he missing in Chrysostom? Because when he reads Chrysostom, you said he looks at it and it's inconsistent. It doesn't make sense to him.
Ultimately, the distinction between Luther and Chrysostom, and when I say Chrysostom, you can say any of the Eastern Fathers, really. You can say pretty much any of the Fathers generally, is that they hold to a different relationship or understanding of the relationship between divine action and human action, divine causality and human causality. And they hold to what you might say is a compatibilist or a non-competitive framework, where humanity and God both operating 100%. There's no contradiction between them. That's not the framework that Luther is holding to. And that's really where you get a lot of the key differences. And that's where I think, whether you think they're right or wrong answers, that's where you start to get all kinds of new answers to these questions, is when you hold to a different framework. And so just to give a really brief, what do we mean when we're talking about, nominalism? So this idea, usually associated with William of Ockham. And so I think Occam is really helpful to come back to, because everybody knows Occam's razor. So what's Occam's razor? Well, you simplify. If you got something that seems like it's overly complicated for no reason, well, then you simplify it. Because why would you make an overly complicated thing if you can just do a less complicated thing that's going to do the same job? And so what's Occam engaging with? What kind of precedes Occam? I have a quote here from the article here. If you're to look at Aquinas and saying, how is it, and not just Aquinas, this is Augustine, this is really all the figures before them. When it comes to questions of how does God's action and humanity's reaction, how do these things relate to each other? This is how Aquinas says it. So I'll read this here. So, traditionally, the operations of God and humanity had been understood to function on distinct planes, so that God's free action was what enabled humanity's secondary agency, with no logical contradiction between the two. As one example, Aquinas writes that while, and this is a quote, one action does not proceed from two agents of the same order, nothing hinders the same action from proceeding from a primary and a secondary agent. So what does that mean? Well, if we're going to say, if we have two planes of causality, so here's primary plane and here's secondary plane. The primary plane, you can have somebody operating, they're the primary actor. A secondary plane, there's a secondary actor. And because there's two different planes of causality, there's no contradiction between them. And so to say that one person does this 100% and that the secondary cause does this 100%, there's no contradiction. The same way you can say with me using a pen to go and to write. Say, okay, well, who wrote that thing that's on the paper? Was it me or was it the pen? And you would say, well, it's not really 50-50. It's kind of like 100%, 100%, but it's me as the primary agent. And then at the primary kind of plane of causality. And then the pen is the secondary agent, the secondary plane of causality. So that's the traditional model. And that's what, in talking about justification, up to getting into the 15th century, that's philosophically, that's what people are thinking. What's Occam do? Well, Occam simplifies. What does that mean? It means that instead of talking about these different planes of causality, and that sounds complicated, I don't know what we're talking about, we'll just simplify it. So we're going to talk about God's action and our action in a univocal kind of way. So it's going to be, we can say God did this or I did this, and we're only talking on one plane of causality. So instead of being one here primary, one here secondary, here we're talking, this is all one plane of causality. We've got rid of all the confusing other things. We just made it simpler. Great, simplify it. Fantastic. We love simple. What does that do? What that does as it relates to the doctrine of justification is this. Instead of, under the previous model, where you could talk about God as acting 100% as the cause of our salvation, And then you could talk about man as in some way as a secondary cause, so dependent on the primary cause, but still as a real cause, as operating, 100% for our salvation. Whereas in the previous model, that could make sense and there was no logical contradiction. Under this newer model with Occam, you can see it doesn't really work because there's only one plane of causality. And so it must mean, if we're saying, okay, who are you justified by? Who acts in justification? How does that work? You kind of have to say, well, there's only 100% to go around, and we're all sort of we have to divide it now. And so maybe God operates 100, maybe like 90% for our salvation, and maybe we operate like 10% for our salvation. Or maybe it's like 50-50. It's like a partnership. So God does 50% of the work for our salvation, and we do 50% of the work for our salvation. Or maybe, 25. I mean, there's all kinds of ways you can construe this. This gives you a totally different sense, and it ends up breeding all kinds of theologies, within the late medieval church that, from my vantage point, I think are frankly abominable. And I think that Luther thought they're abominable too. And so it's probably the area where I have some of the deepest affinity for Luther is in looking at these kinds of things. We're saying, okay, maybe God acts 50% for our salvation, and then we act 50% for our salvation. The idea, and I think that here Luther just has really good Catholic instincts and really good biblical instincts, and I've tried to bring these out. The idea that God somehow acts less than 100% for our salvation seems to Luther to be a most damnable heresy. And I would agree with him there. I think he's absolutely right. I think that biblically, he who has not spared his own son for us, how will he not give us all things? How do you read the Bible and think that God hasn't acted 100% for our salvation? So there's, in a sense, he's got good Catholic instincts there. There's no problem. Where's the issue? Well, the issue is the philosophical system. Because for Luther, because he's holding to this nominalist, and here I'm holding my hands out again, because he's holding to this nominalist system where everybody has, basically, by the way, my finger, I played goalie on an indoor soccer team and I broke my finger. So that's why it looks funny, in case you're wondering, Austin.
I've done that exact thing before.
Did you really?
I have.
Yeah. It's it hurts a little bit, but it's okay. So Luther, he's on this one plane here. And he has that Occamist system, this nominalist system. Well, there's only 100% to go around. And so if God acts 100% for our salvation, what does that mean? It means that we act 0% for our salvation. And this is one of the places where Luther is most insistent, that the righteousness of faith has to be entirely passive. We have to receive it 100% as a gift. Why do we have to receive it 100% as a gift? If it's not, then you're taking it away from God. Anything that you're taking for yourself, if you're going to say, I'm only doing 2% here. That's it, just 2%. What are you doing? You're stealing from God at that point. You're taking what belongs to God, and you're saying, God, let me just have 2% of that. Well, guess what? You're saying, God, you can only operate for my salvation 98%. How does that honor God's action in our salvation? It completely dishonors it from Luther's standpoint. Also, what are you, as a fallible human being, going to do with that 2% of your salvation? You're going to screw it up. Of course you're going to screw it up. Your salvation is just going to be lost in the process. Anything that we try to take away from God, it's inevitably going to be lost. So from Luther's standpoint, because he holds, and this is one of the things where it's actually really helpful in Luther, is how clear he is throughout his writing that he's an Occamist. He holds to this kind of William of Ockham model. And so there's only one plane. We're simplifying things. And it's either God's acting 100% and, we're doing 0, or we're going to try to do 100% and he's going to, do 0. Or if we try to divide it, then we just get a bunch of nonsense that just doesn't take you anywhere. He, looking then back to get to your original question, and this applies to, to Augustine as well, which is uncomfortable for him, of course, but it's the truth. When he looks back at figures like Chrysostom, what does he say? He says, well, Chrysostom, he can speak, really wonderfully about, God's action for our salvation. speak really compellingly about that. It sounds like Luther. But then there's other places where he talks about us working for our salvation as well, where there's some way in which we participate in these kinds of things. And from Luther's standpoint, this is just nonsense because there's only 100% to go around. And so if anything that Chrysostom is saying that we do for our salvation, you are necessarily taking away from God. So Chrysostom, he thinks he's talking, a big game about how God does everything for our salvation, etc. But at the end of the day, he still thinks that we do like 33% of this, and that God only does 66.67 or something like that. And that's the way that all of these figures look to him, which is why he's so frustrated and dismissive of them, because from his standpoint, you can see even psychologically, I think how there's real consequences from this. If you hold to that philosophical system where divine and human action are on the same plane, what that means then is anything that we are doing for our salvation, we're taking away from God doing it. And that, for Luther, is terrible. Now, if I'm just going to say my own standpoint on this, I hold to the earlier model. I don't hold to the Occamist model. And I think that the Occamist model, even just biblically, if you're going to take like Philippians 2, for example, which is one of the passages that I look at towards, the end of the article, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. You think, boy, it just sounds like that's us doing it all, right? Here we are working out our salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who, who's working within you, both to will and to work according to his own good pleasure. And that sounds like God does everything. And the answer is yes. I think that that's absolutely right. I think that that God, being on a divine plane, being the primary cause of our salvation, he does indeed act 100%. And so in that sense, I think that Luther objecting to some of those late medieval theologies that portray God as acting less than 100% for our salvation, as somebody who is kind of within the Catholic tradition, I say absolutely preach the gospel. That's fantastic. And so there is a real good Catholic instinct that I think that Luther has there. The question is, does God acting 100% necessarily mean that we, are and remain entirely passive with anything? Or are we on a secondary plane of causality where God's primary causality enables us to be able to work? And from a standpoint of Philippians 2, I would say, I think it's exactly what Paul is saying. I think he's saying to work out our own, salvation with fear and trembling, which again makes it sound like the ball is all on our court. Well, it's 100% in our court, but it's only because God has done this 100% for us on the primary plane. And he has then enabled us by the power of his Holy Spirit to then act as real agents, even though it's in a secondary way, which is entirely dependent on his primary action for us. And so that's the thing that you keep coming back to over and over in Reformation era debates, and then in the 500 years that have gone on since then. And one of the things that's been really interesting, just in recent decades, is how even among Protestant scholars, there really has been this revival of basically kind of the pre-Occamist view, that actually philosophically to say that God acts almost like God's a creature, and that he acts on the same plane of being as created beings does. That doesn't seem to make any sense. And so a lot of really good New Testament scholars. I mean, John Barclay is somebody who's done a ton of good stuff in this. And N.T. Wright would be somebody else, and helping from Protestant standpoints, helping to return to this pre-Occamist model, which in my view I think is good, because I think it actually makes more sense of the biblical day and is more compatible with it than the one that tries to force everything onto a single plane.